all the performers, and especially our impresario, Martha Nussbaum. I don't think I'm ever going to get out of my mind the picture of Martha with a long dagger full of blood, particularly at faculty meetings. I'm going to be very, very careful. Interdisciplinary scholarship and education is really at the core of our law school. From our founding father, Ernst Freund, to today, we believe that lawyers and legal scholarship are enriched by the insights of the social sciences, of humanities, and the basic sciences. And the interplay between law and literature has really been a very important topic here for years and years. It was at this law school that James Boyd White and Richard Posner started teaching and writing pioneering work about law and literature in the 1970s and the 1980s. And then when Martha joined our faculty, she started teaching the extraordinary Greenberg seminar with Dick Posner and other members of our law faculty, and also part-time lecturers. And it has really turned into one of the most popular seminars and educational experiences for our law school. And it was out of these Greenberg lectures or seminars that our first Law and Literature Conference in 2009 was born. That conference was on Shakespeare and the law, and it was attended by Supreme Court Justice Stephen Breyer and 3 federal judges, our own Dick Posner, Diane Wood, and Frank Easterbrook, and other top scholars. And when Eric Posner, who was chair of the Dean's Search Committee, called me and said, would you be interested in applying or thinking about the job of dean, that I went to the website, and wouldn't you know, the first thing I did when I clicked on the website was I saw Martha, who was playing Ophelia, and then I saw the picture and I saw everything. I said, boy, this is an interesting law school. So that conference featured the first dramatic scenes, like the ones that you just saw performed, which are the highlights of the year. Faculty performed such scenes and from such plays as You Like It, Measure for Measure, and Hamlet. And the last of which gave us what have become one of multiple death scenes that have occurred in this space with Dick Posner as Polonius. Now, since then, we've hosted a number of conferences on gender, law and the British novel, manhood in American law and literature, and each of these conferences has drawn more and more faculty and more students as players and participants. Now, importantly, everything that we do here, both the plays that we do here, as well as the work that we do here, turns into a scholarly effort. So each one of these conferences has ended up with a rich volume of papers, and I'm sure this one will also. And this is really a perfect example of the interplay between law and humanities, and we're really, really proud to have be a host for that. So this afternoon or evening, you're going to be treated to a keynote speech by Scott Turow, followed by a plenary panel. So as not to delay you any further, I'm going to introduce Richard McAdams, who is going to, who also gave us a wonderful performance. What was your character?
Chorus number 2.
With that amazing name, Chorus number 2. And we all think that Richard in high school acted because he was so great. In any event, Richard, when he's not Chorus number 2, is the Bernard D. Meltzer Professor of Law here at the law school. He's particularly well suited to guide us through this afternoon's events, as he's one of the country's foremost experts in criminal law. He focuses his scholarship and his teaching on criminal law and procedures, social norms, inequality, and the expressive function of law. Richard's one of our most active and engaged faculty members, and I'm pleased to ask him to come up here and introduce our plenary speaker. So please, chorus number 2.
Mike, this is an exciting day. I've enjoyed all of our law and literature conferences, but I was particularly happy to have one focused on criminal law. I enjoy crime fiction and mysteries, and particularly those who depict the law and the lawyer. If you've been in my office, you may have seen, for example, the movie poster of the great film Anatomy of a Murder. For decades in crime fiction, actual or accurate law was a fairly rare commodity, and that was before Scott Turow, who I'm honored to introduce today. He is a bit of a hometown hero, having been born and raised in Chicagoland, and is the rarest of things in a crime novelist, an actual lawyer and not a former lawyer. Mr. Turow's first job out of Harvard Law School was as an assistant U.S. attorney here in Chicago. His career was one of great distinction, serving as lead counsel in a number of prosecutions related to corruption in the legal profession, especially those connected to the infamous Operation Greylord, federal investigation of corruption into the Illinois judiciary. After 8 years there, he became a partner at what was then Sonnenschein, Nath and Rosenthal, now known as Dentons, where he remains a practicing attorney today. Most of our students are alas too young to remember the fall of 1987, but then it seemed like everyone was reading Turow's brilliant first novel, Presumed Innocent. My wife and I read it aloud to each other. It was a book full of details that only a working lawyer could get right. Of course, many of our students know Mr. Turow from one of his nonfiction works, 1L, which is very widely read. I guess as a law professor, I'm somewhat worried about how grim the account is of life in law school, but then I remember it's Harvard Law School. The dean was just talking about our performance of scenes from the Oresteia, and I have to note the connection to Mr. Turow's latest novel, Identical, which is set in a city not entirely unlike Chicago, and uses classical Greek characters as inspiration. The novel focuses on the twins Cass and Paul, as in the mythological twins Castor and Pollux. One of them is a prisoner who pled guilty to the murder of his girlfriend Athena Cronon, daughter of their father's great rival Zeus Cronon. So I think it's particularly appropriate that this has come together today. We also had a wonderful musical interlude, and here too is a connection I should note, at least as I understand it, Mr. Turow is a musical performer. He sings regularly with an all-novelist band called the Rock Bottom Remainers, or I think this is an alternative title, and 40 New York Times bestsellers, One Lousy Band. As the lead guitarist Dave Barry says, they play music about as well as Metallica writes novels. And so we're greatly honored to have you here, whether you sing for us or not. But join me in welcoming Mr. Scott Turow.
Well, thank you, Richard, very much. Those of you who have heard me sing before will be very relieved to know that I'm not going to do it again. I'm going to, and I'm not checking my email. I'm actually going to read, and I'm going to read the prologue to Presumed Innocent, assuming that this little gizmo cooperates. All right. Opening statement. This is how I always start. I am the prosecutor. I represent the state. I am here to present to you the evidence of a crime. Together, you will weigh this evidence. You will deliberate upon it. You will decide if it proves the defendant's guilt. This man, and here I point. You must always point, Rusty, I was told by John White. That was the day I started in the office. The sheriff took my fingerprints, the chief judge swore me in, and John White brought me up to watch the first jury trial I'd ever seen. Ned Halsey was making the opening statement for the state, and as he gestured across the courtroom, John, in his generous, avuncular way with the humid scent of alcohol on his breath at 10 in the morning, whispered my initial lesson. He was the chief deputy prosecuting attorney then, a hale Irishman with white hair wild as corn silk. It was almost a dozen years ago, long before I had formed even the most secret ambition to hold John's job myself. If you don't have the courage to point, John White whispered, you can't expect them to have the courage to convict. And so I point. I extend my hand across the courtroom. I hold one finger straight. I seek the defendant's eye. I say, this man has been accused. He turns away or blinks or shows nothing at all. In the beginning, I was often preoccupied, imagining how it would feel to sit there, held at the focus of scrutiny, ardently denounced before all who cared to listen, knowing that the most ordinary privileges of a decent life, common trust, personal respect, and even liberty were now like some cloak you had checked at the door and might never retrieve. I could feel the fear, the hot frustration, the haunted separateness. Now, like ore deposits, the harder stuff of duty and obligation has settled in the veins where those softer feelings moved. I have a job to do. It is not that I have grown uncaring, believe me, but this business of accusing, judging, punishing has gone on always. It is one of the great wheels turning beneath everything we do. I play my part. I am a functionary of our only universally recognized system of telling wrong from right, a bureaucrat of good and evil. This must be prohibited, not that. One would expect that after all these years of making charges, trying cases, watching defendants come and go, it might all have become a jumble. Somehow, it has not. I turn back to face the jury. Today, you, all of you, have taken on one of the most solemn obligations of citizenship. Your job is to find the facts, the truth. It is not an easy task, I know. Memories may fail, recollections may be shaded, the evidence might point in differing directions. You may be forced to decide about things that no one seems to know or to be willing to say. If you were at home, at work, anywhere in your daily life, you might be ready to throw up your hands. You might not want to make the effort. Here, you must. You must. Let me remind you, there was a real crime. No one will dispute that. There was a real victim, real pain. You do not have to tell us why it happened. People's motives, after all, may be forever locked inside them. But you must at least try to determine what actually occurred. If you cannot, we will not know if this man deserves to be freed or punished. We will have no idea who to blame. If we cannot find the truth, what is our hope of justice? So I want to talk about how the very circuitous route that took me to write that, to become a crime novelist and a lawyer. The latter was quite a surprise to me. When I left home at the age of 17 and went to Amherst College in 1966, I was hungry to become a novelist. That was my great dream. It had been born first when I read The Count of Monte Cristo and was totally captivated by the novel and somehow thought, probably inspired by my mother, whose dream was to be a novelist, that it would be, if it was that exciting to read a novel, imagine how much more exciting it must have been to write one, to feel the story come to life within you and to live with it for a longer span of time. So I went off to Amherst, determined to become a novelist, and was dashed to discover upon arriving that there was no such thing there as a creative writing class. Of course, if I had spent more time looking at the course catalog rather than the magnificent landscape, which had caused me to want to go to Amherst College, I would have known that. But instead, I sort of approached in a state of bewilderment members of the faculty and said, well, why don't you teach creative writing here? And one of them explained to me that creative writing had no more intellectual content than auto shop or basket weaving. And secondly, you couldn't teach anybody to be a novelist or a poet any way those people are born. Of course, if I had wanted to be a concert pianist and they had talked to somebody in the music department, they would have mentioned the need to practice. So I came home with that first summer with no instruction in creative writing and determined a couple of things. One was that, of course, I had to get a job as a college student. And the other was that I was going to try to write a novel on my own because nobody else was going to help me in this task. And what I did that summer during the day was I became a substitute letter carrier in Glencoe, Illinois. I was a mailman. And post office employment as Herman Melville and Eudora Welty have recorded as its interesting aspects. In my case, it was a pretty steep learning curve. I was overwhelmed at first by the need to sort of sort a route and then deliver it. But it was one of those tasks that after a number of weeks I had easily mastered to the point that I discovered that it did not take me the 8 hours allotted to deliver all the mail. And so one time I made the mistake of coming back to the post office early. And at that point, the chief clerk, a fellow named Walter, who retired only a few years ago, took me down to the basement in the employees' lunchroom and explained to me in very colorful terms what might happen if I was unwise enough to come back to the post office early ever again, and that I was due to appear only at 3:15 when I was scheduled to punch out. So that meant I had between an hour and 2 hours every afternoon to myself. The only air-conditioned building in those days in downtown Glencoe was the library. So I decided I would cool my heels, as it were, in the library. And once I was there, I realized that I knew what I should do, which was to read what I had surely learned during my first year in college taking English classes was the leading candidate around for the title of greatest novel ever written. That would be James Joyce's Ulysses. I had read Portrait of the Artist as a young man. I read the stories of Dubliner. I was beguiled by all of them. And so I decided that I would find Ulysses on the shelf, and thereafter, every day for the next 6 weeks, for an hour to 2 hours, every afternoon, I read Ulysses. And when I was done, I had come to a number of observations. The first was, of course, that I had read many of the most gorgeous sentences that I'd ever encountered. It was beautiful writing. The second observation was that this was not a novel as I sort of thought of novels. It wasn't a novel like The Count of Monte Cristo. It wasn't even a novel like Portrait of the Artist as a young man, in the sense that I was not really carried through Ulysses by concern for a character and what would happen to him or her. This was at some levels a novel about writing a novel, and it was hard. It was hard reading. I was not unhappy that the taxpayers of the United States were paying me $2.52 every hour I spent at it. But the third thing, and perhaps the most striking to me, was that the library's loan copy of Ulysses was always there when I went to look for it every day. So here I was in a very affluent community with a very high educational level, and enigmatically, no one else in that town wanted to read the greatest novel ever written. And I began a long dialogue with myself about the question of whether it could really be the greatest novel ever written if nobody else in an affluent, well-educated town actually wanted to read it. The one thing that I concluded over many years is that whether novels appeal to a very narrow elite or a smaller or a larger, but in some ways more humdrum audience, that the aspiration, at least, of art ought to be to create universals. That, and that, as I was to express it some years later when I was a writing fellow at Stanford, you know, to me, the greatest novel ever written would have to be appealing to both a bus driver and an English professor, and exciting to them both. So when I came home from writing Ulysses during the day, I did something very different at night, which is that I wrote a novel. And I wrote a novel, as I said, because nobody was going to teach me how to write a novel, and I figured I may as well just plunge in and do it, which of course is the only secret ingredient there is. Phil Knight, the founder of Nike, is a fancier of my books, and I once wrote him a note back in response to one of his saying that, you know, at Nike they had stolen the novelist's slogan, namely, just do it. What I wrote naturally without training, Ulysses notwithstanding, was a novel about two young men from the north side of Chicago, as I had once been, who ran away, followed the Mississippi down to New Orleans, and there in New Orleans they witnessed the murder of an African-American prostitute. Now, it was, in other words, a crime novel, even though I didn't realize that. It was 1967 by then. I was a veteran of the civil rights movement. I thought it was a civil rights novel about the bad ways of the Old South. But I finished the novel over the course of the summer. Martha and others will probably find it amusing that I called it Dithyramb. Perhaps over dinner, Martha will explain to me why I did that. Because I don't remember exactly what that term means. It's some kind of Bacchic dance. But apparently, Richard, I've been invoking classic themes in these novels for a long time. Dithyramb went the way of many novels that I was to write thereafter, which is to say, I sent it to New York. It's a stamped, self-addressed envelope, and with a passage of time, it was returned to me in that stamped, self-addressed envelope, usually with a form rejection letter. And my roommates, my three roommates, of course, noticed that this was happening as I trudging back from the mailboxes with the manuscript under my arm every couple of weeks. And of course, being like young men always, they decided to torment me about it. And the way that they tormented me was by reading to me statistics that happened to appear in Time magazine one week, showing that Mickey Spillane, the crime writer, was the best-selling novelist in the world. In those days, Mickey Spillane had sold 18 million copies of his books. I, of course, responded, having learned not much in a year and a half in college, but certainly having learned how to be pretentious. Oh, that's just junk. I could write a novel like that in 3 weeks. And my roommates looked at me and said, well, what kind of junky novel could you write in 3 weeks? And it turned out that I actually had an idea for a junky novel that somehow was right near the front of my mind. And my idea was, as I said, a civil rights movement veteran. I thought what the United States needed was a black superhero. And it happened that I had one in mind. He was called John Henry Steele, the Protector. And John Henry Steele, the Protector, was the son of a wealthy white industrial magnate and famous African-American jazz singer named Lena Horne, and John Henry Steele turns his back on his father's business and instead becomes a protector, that is to say, a kind of private secret service who keeps people alive and has sex every 20 pages. And my roommates thought that this sounded like a splendid outline for a novel, and so they made me the following offer, that they would go to class for me for the next 3 weeks, take notes, outline papers. I would sit at home and write John Henry Steele, The Protector, day after day. In the 3 weeks I said I could do it. And then, of course, when we sent it to New York and riches befell me, I would actually divide them 4 ways. And 2 of the roommates went on to become corporate lawyers, the third the chairman of Northwest Airlines, and I always look back and realize that I was history's first victim of an LBO. But anyway, I did it. History unfortunately intervened. Dr. Martin Luther King was killed that spring, an epical event that changed the United States for decades and decades to come, and made it totally unacceptable for a young white college student to be writing a book about an African-American anybody. And that didn't, of course, keep us from sending the novel out with a colorful cover letter describing how it had been created. And there was one editor who wrote back and said, of course, the novel was unpublishable, but the cover letter might make a promising start on a book. I decided that I would give up, trashy writing and go back to what I thought were my more serious efforts. And by the time I was a junior, I went to Boston. A friend had introduced me to a young woman, and kind of hit it off. And I remember we saw a movie, I think it was The Graduate, although it doesn't fit the timeline. But at any rate, we got to talking, and she described to me having been raped the prior summer. And of course, it was a horrifying story. I wish I could say it was the last time somebody told me a story about being raped, but it's not. And it was unsettling to me, of course. I went back to Amherst, and I got sick. I developed a fever, and I was, the typical fever dream. And I got up out of my sick bed about 24 hours later, and I began to write. And I wrote continuously for the next 12 hours. And that was the first moment that I really felt gripped by what I was writing in the way I guess I hoped I would when I read The Count of Monte Cristo. And what I wrote, oddly, was a short story about a rape. It was later published in the Transatlantic Review. But in the weird way that a writer's imagination transmogrifies the raw materials, my short story was written from the rapist's point of view. And I can explain the choices, but the fact of the matter was I thought it was a good story. And as I say, it was the first thing that I was fortunate enough to publish. When I finished college, I had this dream of becoming a creative writing fellow at Stanford. I have realized that many of the American writers whom I most admired, whether it was Larry McMurtry or Robert Stone or a lesser-known name, Tilly Olson, who was a great icon to me, had all been through the writing program at Stanford. I wanted to do that too, and I was lucky enough to win a writing fellowship out there and went out there in 1970. And as I like to say, those were good years and bad years. They were good years in the sense that I was surrounded by a number of very talented young writers. Their sheer audacity in being willing say out loud the same thing that I said, namely that they wanted to be a writer, was encouraging to me and helped confirm me in that identity, which frankly is part of the struggle as a young person in the arts. They were bad years in other senses. One of the things that characterized the community of young writers around Stanford is that while they did not all write like Ernest Hemingway, they all drank like Ernest Hemingway, and certainly did a number of other related activities. So there were years of some dissipation. But I did, of course, try my hand yet again at writing a novel. This time the novel, which was called The Way Things Are, was about a rent strike in Chicago. And in order to write this novel about a rent strike, I learned about something called the implied warranty of habitability, which was a doctrine then being incorporated in American law, which set aside the age-old fiction to the common law that a tenant in an apartment is renting only the right to occupy the land below the apartment, and instead was actually renting a dwelling. American courts were beginning to say a dwelling which, because that was what the tenant was renting, she had every right to expect to be fit to live in. Now, I will say that I was absolutely captivated by the implied warranty of habitability. The many publishers to whom The Way Things Are, this novel was sent, were less captivated by it. The heart of the novel, though, was a kind of massive conspiracy. The book has sort of a protagonist who's an ex-draft dodger who's come back from Canada heartbroken, and the young man who tries to interest him in activism again, who is, for lack of any other convenient labor, kind of Catholic worker type, socialist Catholic, who keeps digging at the great secret of who owns all of this slum property on the north side of Chicago, only to find that most of it is owned by the Catholic Archdiocese of Chicago, a circumstance that had actually proven to be true around Morningside Heights in New York. So, if I looked backwards at what I had been doing, this massive conspiracy in The Way Things Are, my short story about a rapist, John Henry Steele, the Protector, dithyramb about the effort of these two young men to get justice for the murder of a prostitute, I would have recognized a theme in all of this writing, which is to say crime. But I was absolutely blind to it. I didn't see it at all. I thought of myself as Joyce's would-be successor, and not as a crime novelist who had any heritage at all with that junk writer Mickey Spillane. So I was totally unprepared for the degree to which I found myself entranced by the activities of the friends of mine who, during the 5 years I was out at Stanford, because I taught there for 3 years after finishing my fellowship, they had graduated from law school, and they had now begun working as lawyers. And the ones who interested me were the ones who were working in the criminal law. I went up to Seattle to watch my friend Jay Rich, one of the roommates who was involved in the creation of John Henry Steele, the Protector. And Jay at that point was working as an intern in the King County Prosecutor's Office. And he was trying, very, very small traffic cases. But I still thought it was amazing that, here was my friend involved in the liberty and punishment of other human beings. Another friend, Jeremy Margolis, who'd gone to a little bit ahead of me in school. Jeremy had gone into the U.S. Attorney's Office in Chicago. He was not involved in rum-dum cases. They were major cases, and he was also the executive assistant U.S. Attorney. And I would sit there enthralled as he described these trials to me. I had a friend in Seattle whom I made, may he rest in peace, a man named Jim Hunt, who was a criminal defense lawyer. And I listened to Jim's stories about trying cases. Jim confessed that every morning when he was on trial, that he would rush to the bathroom and bend over the basin and be sick. And I was so enchanted by the world of criminal law that even that part sounded good. So in There Lies the Tale, and although it stunned my colleagues in the English department at Stanford, I decided that I would truly live a life of regret if I did not go to law school. And so I made what seemed to be a dramatic U-turn in my life and decided that I would head off for law school. I actually remember sitting in the Green Lounge trying to talk to students in this law school and get an idea of what it was like to be here. Now, in deciding to go to law school, of course, writing seemed to hang in the balance. I had promised myself my whole life up till then that I was going to be a novelist, and I was unwilling to set that dream aside. Because I'd done so much unpublished work, I felt it hard to explain to the literary agent who had been kind enough to represent me for a number of years, trying to sell the way things are to the 24 publishers in New York who didn't want it. And as a throwaway line in the letter I wrote to her, I said, you know, I haven't been able to find a good book by a law student describing what it's actually like to be a law student. By then there was the novel Paper Chase, but I didn't think I was likely to fall in love with my professor's daughter. So that didn't seem to me to describe what I was headed for. And there were lots of books, frankly, by faculty members telling students, you know, how they ought to think about studying the law, but nothing that described what it was actually like to be a law student. And I made this observation mostly as a sop to my agent, thinking that if she happened to know a nonfiction writer, like me, I was a novelist, I was an artiste, that she might want to try that out on them. And the way the story goes, she went out to lunch with an editor named Ned Chase, who was Chevy Chase's father, and who was every bit as zany as his son. And the two of them basically started raining, and they got drunk. And Elizabeth found my letter in her purse. And neither one of them noticed that I was not actually proposing to write this book. And Ned wrote a contract for it on the spot. And so I get lots of mail from Elizabeth, my agent, but all of it was rejection letters. Here's sort of like college admissions. Here's the fat envelope and a contract inside to write one out. And I really didn't dare turn my back on that opportunity. And so, as I like to say, I signed the contract and I went off to Harvard Law School to make new friends and to write about them. During that, I wrote one out after my first summer in law school. And at one point I returned home while I was, engaged in the daily occupation of writing. I was writing 14 hours a day in order to finish it. And I happened to visit Jeremy, whom I mentioned was the executive assistant U.S. attorney, and the U.S. attorney himself, Sam Skinner, who ultimately went on to become the Secretary of Transportation and Chief of Staff to the first George Bush. Sam walked in and he sat down. He was unhappy. Jeremy was his chief confidant, and Sam was unhappy because his kingdom was about to diminish. There was a bill in Congress to shrink the Northern District of Illinois and to create a new separate Western District of Illinois. And Sam read out the counties, the list of counties that were going to become part of the Western District of Illinois. And he looked at me and he said, "How many is that?" And I said, 17. And later in the afternoon, after Jeremy and I came back from lunch, Sam said, I want you to work in this office next summer. Years later, I of course, got to know Sam well, and I said, were there really 17 counties? Did I actually get it by accident? He says, no. He said, I had no idea how many counties there were. I said, well, why did you hire me? He said, because you looked so confident when you said 17. But you would make a good trial lawyer. At any rate, I did work there in the second year, but I get a little ahead of myself because Ned Chase, who'd been drunk when he bought 1L, called me up after I finished the manuscript, and he said he had just one question for me, which was namely, why did I ever want to buy this book? Whatever great interest Americans were to take in the law, I had no foreknowledge of that, but I certainly predicted it, full-throatedly to Ned Chase in order to sell him back the book that became 1L. Because Ned was so dubious about publishing the book, I had to go ahead and publish it while I was still a law student at Harvard Law School. And I changed names, of course, to protect the guilty, but it's a work of nonfiction, and people read 1L and understood, that who they were. Naturally, the people who thought they were favorably portrayed thought that 1L was a distinguished work of literature. Those who did not think they were favorably portrayed had other opinions, and chief among those with other opinions was one of my first-year professors who claimed that he was the basis for the heavy of 1L, a character whom I called Professor Rudolph Perini. And as 1L came to good fortune and drew good notices, this professor was actually so agitated that he called a news conference to announce that he wanted all speculation ended. He wanted the world to know that he, in fact, was Perini, and he was madder than hell about it. I thought that performance would have been enough to satisfy him, but I was wrong. And at the end of my first semester in my third year at Harvard Law School, one of my friends came running from this particular professor's copyright class. And the last question on his exam went something like this. You are an associate in a large law firm. I have to say that I never had an exam question at Harvard Law School that did not begin with that assumption. You are an associate in a large law firm. A senior partner has introduced you to his valued client, Professor Rudolph Perini. Professor Perini has undergone the humiliating experience of having a student, Ray Ripoff, write a book based upon Professor Perini's daily classroom lectures. Please list all causes of action that Professor Perini can bring against Ray Ripoff. So I made two conclusions from that. One was that I had to get out of there, and I went to work as an intern in the Suffolk County District Attorney's Office. That would be to say the Boston State Prosecutor's Office. It was a turbulent time in that office. I worked for a man named Tim O'Neill, who brilliant lawyer, but also, interestingly to me, a poet who read his work aloud in the Cambridge Tavern, Plough and the Stars. The district attorney in Boston at that time was a man named Garrett Byrne. He was approaching 80 years old, and he was challenged by another of his assistants, a man named Newman Flanagan, who had risen to prominence in Boston by an act of what I thought was pretty blatant race baiting. He prosecuted an obstetrician named Kenneth Edelin, who passed away within the last 6 weeks, for breaking Boston's fairly restrictive abortion laws, and he was trying him for manslaughter of a fetus. Edelin was acquitted, but it brought Flanagan to prominence, and he actually ended up beating Garrett Byrne after I left. So I went to the U.S. Attorney's office in Chicago. I'd been hired by them. Sam was gone, but Tom Sullivan was here and hired me, although he was very apprehensive about 1L. Before he hired me, he brought me in, and he had the Code of Federal Regulations in front of him, and he said, you know, I want you to read this, and I want you to read every one of these rules, and I want you to understand that you can't write a word about this job. And he said, and besides, you can't write a word about me. I'll kill you. Tom really was my principal mentor in the law, and every time I get to introduce him somewhere, I'd like to tell that story. I was still faithful to my vow to continue writing. And I tried writing what was a kind of long literary story. Had a new agent, and there actually was a young editor in New York, a man named Jonathan Galassi, who was interested in this longish story that I was turning into a kind of short novel. When Gail called me to say Jonathan was interested, I said, forget about it. I'm working on something much better. And this was by the time I was in my second year as an AUSA, and I had begun the book that would be Presumed Innocent. I was overcome by what I was experiencing as a prosecutor. I was seething with riling emotion every day. The battles that went on with defense lawyers, their occasional underhandedness, the sheer effort that was required to bring somebody who I thought was obviously a crook to justice was sort of startling to me. The difficulties of discovering the truth were also amazing to me. The problems with getting law enforcement agents to understand the way lawyers saw the criminal process and had to enforce it. The problems with witnesses of getting them to tell the truth or even to know the truth or recall it. And so that was what I wrote about. And of course, I set it in Boston to start. That's what I thought I was writing about. And I wrote about an office where the veteran prosecutor was being challenged by one of his assistants who'd come to prominence with a race-baiting prosecution of an abortionist. And I was just really following the old saw of writing about what I knew. Even as I was writing Presumed Innocent, I did not think that I was becoming a crime novelist, even as I knew that crime had this immense hold on me. And it wasn't until I became a supervisor in the office, and I was several years along by then in my writing of Presumed Innocent on the morning commuter train. I became a supervisor, and I went up to watch one of the younger lawyers I was supervising try a case. And it was the so-called star witness, the person who was really relating most of the tale about how something the community regarded as evil had occurred. And I looked around the courtroom, and I saw who was there, and I realized how spellbound every single person in the courtroom was by this story of what was happening on the witness stand. And I suddenly realized, oh, crime. If you want a universal audience, this is a subject that creates a universal audience. Obviously, the Oresteia shows us how long crime has been a popular theme in literature. I don't have a lot that's original to say about why that is the case. I can say for me that I think my fascination with it was rooted in childhood experiences that left me feeling that power was being abused toward me, and that I had lots of questions about what was right and what was wrong, and could this possibly be. But I mean, it's I think fairly clear to all of us that transgression is of enormous interest. It's inherently of interest because we are all battling the impulse to do wrong. I know here at the University of Chicago, everybody has a cast iron superego, but anybody who has observed an infant grow up knows that we are all egocentric savages to start. And Freud, as Freud taught us, taming these impulses is the great task of civilization and the sad lament sometimes of having to live in society. People can't help being fascinated by wrongdoing because they are all would-be wrongdoers themselves. In addition, there's sometimes a sense in a lot of criminal literature, and you see it in the Oresteia, as Clytemnestra is engaged in some of her speeches, that the criminal is a more authentic person, freed from social restraint. The criminal is free to be herself, whether it is herself motivated by a lust for power or vengeance for the sacrifice of her daughter. And this manifests itself in the criminal world where everybody's familiar with the phenomenon that in many cases and in many neighborhoods, the criminals and the cops are separated only by who is wearing the uniform. They share a lot of the same interests and a lot of the same view of the world, and that indeed is true of criminal defense lawyers. Most of us have very ambivalent relationships with our clients because we cannot help at moments admiring them. And in some ways, this admiration is well placed. I always caution people that criminality is one of the great expressions of human imagination. And this is particularly true in white-collar crimes, although sometimes a crime's basis, murder, is committed in an incredibly imaginative way. The other point, of course, is that the crime story is all about reasserting control over these unruly impulses. Justice, as the Oresteia tells us, will ultimately be done. When I was coming to the end of the first draft of Presumed Innocent, I decided that I was going to write a radically new kind of crime novel and not say who committed the crime. It would be, the literary equivalent of The Lady and the Tiger. And with a lot of thinking about it, I realized that I was breaking the rules. The crime novel, the mystery, exists on the assumption that we can reconstruct history and say whodunit with an exactness that the courtroom very often cannot. And furthermore, that we can say whodunit and we can say why. Rusty says that in the criminal process we don't need to tell motives, but literature does. All narrative works on the convention that motive can be known and understood. Whether that's actually true or not, I don't know for sure, but we certainly live inside that box, the belief that motive can be known and understood. And that is, I think, the great moral purpose of narrative in literature, which is to let us stand in somebody else's shoes, to understand what it is like to be them, so that we can truly do unto others as we would have them do unto us. But most mysteries teach a far broader lesson, which is that crime does not pay. The wrongdoer will always be brought to justice in the end. When Presumed Innocent was in Hollywood. Tula, the director, came back to me and said, you know, they really don't like the ending of the novel. In the novel of Presumed Innocent, the bad guy gets away. And so they wanted to rewrite the ending so that the bad person would go to an insane asylum. And the preview audiences for the movie, fortunately for me, hated that ending. Alan put it to me, well, they didn't seem to like it, and Harrison Ford told me more plainly, said they threw popcorn boxes at the screen. So if you go back and look at Presumed Innocent again, you'll notice that the last shot in the movie is actually the first shot with a new voiceover recorded over it. I think I will stop there, except to say that I left the U.S. Attorney's Office after 8 years, and I had what would again seem to have been a fairly naive revelation. I realized that it wasn't going to stop. I had been there long enough to see the same defendants come around for a second and even a third time. One man who had bought suits as a form of bribery for the Attorney General had turned up getting prosecuted in the Board of Tax Appeals investigation. He was bribing hearing officers to reduce real estate tax reductions. And frankly, even after he was gone, and I was doing Greylord, I found evidence that he had paid off the judge and ended up having to drag the representatives of his estate into the grand jury. Crime is part of life. There will always be crime, just as surely as there will always be love. Transgression is with us forever. It is part of living in society. As the litigators would say, further he saith not.
Thank you so much. I want to apologize for calling Presumed Innocent your first novel. It turns out to be far from accurate. And let me briefly introduce my colleagues on the panel, and then we can get to some questions and comments. My colleague Alison LaCroix received her BA and JD from Yale University, her PhD in history from Harvard, and joined the law faculty in 2006, where she's now professor of law and Ludwig and Hilda Wolf teaching scholar. She co-edited with Martha one of the volumes from a prior law and literature conference titled Subversion and Sympathy, Gender Law in the British Novel in the 18th and 19th Centuries. And then my colleague, Judge Diane Wood, is Chief Judge of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Seventh Circuit and Senior Lecturer in Law. Joined the Seventh Circuit in 1995, before which she was on the faculty here as Harold J. and Marion F. Green Professor of International Legal Studies. Why don't I start by asking you, Judge Wood, if you have a question or comment.
Well, that was a wonderful presentation. So my first point is just to thank Scott for his thoughtful comments. I love the idea that it actually requires literature to probe into motives. You know, I deal all the time with these sorts of things too. I mean, fully half of our docket is criminal matters, and you see a story in every one of them, and sometimes you don't have too much trouble figuring out what somebody's motive was. If he's robbing banks, you figure he wants the money, right?
That's what Willie Sutton said.
Yeah, exactly. That's where the money is.
Right.
On the other hand, there are crimes. The U.S. Attorney's Office of late has had a big priority for child pornography, internet things, and that's much harder to figure out. It's much harder and a little disturbing not to be able to get any sense of why this this happens. You can fall back on easy things and say maybe it's mental illness or what have you. But I really think you need to turn to literature in a way and to other secondary sources, sometimes social science research, because it's very unsatisfying to put somebody in prison for 30 years for something that you're not really sure you have a handle on. So I think that the kind of, I totally agree that for better or for worse, the crime is with us, and it doesn't seem to diminish. And I was working on a case just today that I thought, oh, it's old Mr. So-and-so again. You know, I've seen his cases a number of times. Here he is. So some people are incorrigible. But the light that, and the other thing that literature can do that we don't get on the ground is offer some resolution. Some cases, again, you're pretty sure you do know exactly what happened. There are many other cases where, even in the most serious case, a death penalty case, you're just not sure. You know, is this the right person? Because if it is, the person did something unspeakably awful. But boy, if it's not the right person, what are you doing? You know, and who was the person out there? And so you live with these uncertainties that literature can kind of help you through to the end in a way that you can't on the ground.
All right.
Alison.
Yes. So I guess, well, one question that came to mind as you were speaking, Scott, and it was fantastically interesting, is, it sounds facetious, but I wonder if today a law student in your situation would actually have been writing a blog instead of 1L. And what would that mean? I mean, it would be more instant, and yet there wouldn't be a novel in the same way. And so what that says about these kinds of experiences, and especially sort of first-person accounts that are that live on as books in a way they might not, or perhaps I'm wrong about that and I'm showing my age that I think, you know, the blogger is not living on in that way. So that's a question. And then following, I think, on this idea of stories, I think one thing that's very striking in a lot of crime novels and crime fiction about lawyers, I think, is distinct from police procedurals, which seem like a different genre, is the use of the kind of authorial control, and you mentioned this. And so, I mean, in Identical, the most recent novel, which I just finished reading and really enjoyed, there's the sort of beginnings of parts that you write in this italic about what it seems clearly to be what actually happened from different perspectives. And that, following on Judge Wood's point, I mean, I think it's a way of, the reader feels like she knows what actually happened. And it's interesting to me that crime fiction seems to allow that kind of authorial control. So I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on either of those points.
Shall I respond now, Richard?
Sure.
Well, the conventions of the mystery, in particular, are the things I think that have led it traditionally to be regarded as a lesser literary form. That you do have to say what happened and who did it and why, and it's formulaic enough that it seems to reduce the freedom that you would expect in a quote unquote serious novel. So I think I always thought a great deal about it, and I mean, there's obviously truth in the observation that the novel, the mystery novel, depends upon a pretty complete reconstruction of what happened, and that by itself, as anybody knows who spent a lot of time in courtrooms, is that is a fiction of the highest order. Just ask any historian. I mean, I'm sure that you know that deciding exactly what happened and choosing just one narrative is essentially reductionistic. So that does
work against the mystery as a form. On the other hand, when you really stand back from it, it's just astonishing the amount of time that Americans spend sucked into these stories. It's still the leading genre on television. I think in terms of raw sales, if you throw in the many different forms, mysteries and crime stories are still the leading the leading genre in terms of book sales. These stories do have an eternal appeal, and they're obviously, when you see the same themes in a work of literature of the sort of classic standing of the Oresteia, you realize that whether it's low or high, these themes are powerful.
I really enjoyed your story of how you became a novelist, and it was fascinating. I think people often assume when they don't know that success was easy or obvious, inevitable, when it wasn't. I have a question which I think concerns me, because maybe it's too much of a softball given this audience, but I'm kind of interested in it. So let's just assume I'm skeptical about whether reading literature, writing literature, understanding literature would help you be a better lawyer. Certainly, the law and literature crowd sort of makes such claims that if you're there's trial advocacy ideas about you have to tell the jury a narrative, and so maybe someone who understands literature is better able to figure that out. But then again, maybe it's just you can be a good storyteller without that. And then I also wonder if when you cross-examine people, if the idea of empathy and getting in someone's head through literature gives you an experience that helps you understand maybe why they're lying or why they're shading the truth in such a way that if you understand, then you can either expose it or maybe manipulate it or something. So this is in this group, I guess this is a kind of conventional truth, and I'm wondering, can you disabuse us of this, or is this?
Well, I would not argue against the place of law and literature in today's law schools. Although, I think its main advantage is because of what it does for legal education and how it loosens the bindings. A friend of mine went from his PhD at Stanford to the English department at the University of Minnesota, and then to law school there. He's now a practicing lawyer, a guy named Mark Savin. And Mark always liked to point out that, as James Boyd White does, that the lawyer is a writer, that the lawyer, as a writer, is engaged it possesses a voice, and it's a very restricted voice. It's a voice that, generally speaking, shuns metaphor of any kind, and it also generally shuns discussion of emotion. There are not a lot of judicial opinions that talk a lot about love, and so to me, one of the great functions of law and literature is to help law students literally recognize the conventions of the law and of the legal voice. I also there's a passage from White's *The Edge of Meaning* that I love to refer to from time to time when he talks about the law as, and I suspect Richard, that this is something you talk about too, but the way that the law helps express grievances that are otherwise voiceless. And he talks about White had gone from Amherst to graduate school in English at Harvard, and then went and began thinking about law school and sat in courtrooms, and was very, very mindful of the way the law was addressing experience. And as he says, that it was taking what was often mute suffering and giving it a voice. And I think all of those understandings of what we are about as lawyers is dramatically enhanced when you compare legal texts implicitly to literature. Does it help to have a more subtle sense of people's motives, especially, I think, in the practice of criminal law? Absolutely. Absolutely, because you can, as criminal lawyers often do, badmouth your client so that you're creating. I never understood it when I was a prosecutor. People would have to come in and tell me what a crumb their client was. Well, I knew the person was a crumb. I was ruining their lives. I knew that person was not a good person. But of course, what the lawyer was trying to say was, I'm not that person. I may have to stick up for him, but I know that that he's kind of a slug. But in point of fact, I found in practicing criminal law that you can't really represent somebody without understanding them in some ways. And and apropos of Judge Wood's point about child pornography, it is unfathomable to many of us, and yet, because it's unfathomable, I think it's gone on, because we can't stand to contemplate it. The taboos are so strong, understandably, as they should be. So it was mind-blowing to me when I went down to 26th Street, when I began doing pro bono work down there, and I don't know if it's true today, but half of the cases that were coming up at 26th Street, where the state court criminal cases are heard, half of them were child abuse cases, child sexual abuse cases. So that's not the same thing as child pornography, but obviously that's some of the same impulses. But anyway, I am a big fan of the law and literature movement. I think it's, as I said, I think what it brings to the study of law, just like, frankly, what I studied of legal history, gives you a much rounder sense of what your project is as a lawyer.
Okay, we are past the scheduled time, but let me ask if there are a couple of questions from the audience. I think we have time for that. Jonathan.
Mr. Turow, I wanted to ask what it was like for you to go to law school, sort of as you say, with the intention of meeting people in order to write about them, and how, I was hoping you could say a little bit about how you think that affected the experiences you had and the way you related to people there, and or even perhaps influenced the behavior of people who you were observing, the very fact that you knew you were there to observe them.
Well, many different responses. One, I have never pretended, and I always thought it was fairly clear from the text that 1L is the diary of an unabashed neurotic. As I said, I thought I was confessing that pretty openly. When somebody says that they made notes in 7 different colors, and they're confessing to a level of compulsiveness that's outside the norm. My passion for the law, though, was real. And so the sense that I was observing my classmates, I don't think interfered with my experience very much, because, of course, that is who I am. And I am, as liable to write about what I've seen here today as what I saw in my law school classrooms. I was so stirred up by that experience that it was, really helpful for me to write about it. And I literally was just keeping a journal at first, and there's something obviously cathartic about it. The experience, oddly, that I think that had the greatest impact on me was not the fact that I was writing. It was the fact that when I entered law school, despite my huge interest in the law, I felt after all these unpublished novels that I was a failure. I had declared since I was 11 years old that I was going to be a novelist. And there I was at the ripe old age of 26, having not accomplished that. And it was hard for anybody, to explain to me, certainly I didn't believe it, that, there was still time. So, one, I was haunted by failure more than anything else, but also intense interest in the law.
Yes.
Yes, Professor. I probably am I have a practice pointer. I'm an attorney from Anchorage, Alaska, and I was a prosecutor and pursuing my Master's of Fine Arts in Creative Writing at the very same time. Do not tell the other prosecutors you love literature. So if any of you are in that position, you're not going to make friends, you're not going to get in the clique, and you're absolutely right, prosecutors may not emote. I had a book of poetry in my drawer, and I would put a poem a day on my bulletin to help deal with really the loss of humanity and the loss of spirit, which is what I think lawyers is really happening with criminals, and you won't make friends doing it. You'll become a good writer, and you'll become a stronger person, but watch it. Just be careful. I wonder if you have any thoughts on that.
Well, I was lucky, frankly, to be in a federal prosecutor's office where a lot of the crimes are economic crimes, and you're not dealing with literally, as you are often in a state courtroom, with the worst things human beings can do to each other. And a lot of people in that system become necessarily really hard-hearted. Indeed, it's really a triumph in that system, the people who can understand the role of kindness in a very hard world. And some do and some don't. But I don't think there's anything wrong with trying to educate lawyers to be that way, and to have a complex understanding, of motives. And there's usually an enormous gap in class between prosecutors and the people that they're prosecuting. That is not true in the U.S. Attorney's Office, because very often you're prosecuting people of the same social class. Indeed, I spent my entire 8 years in the U.S. Attorney's Office prosecuting other lawyers. And so it changes the way that you relate to the defendants. And I confess that I sometimes felt very, very sorry for some of the people I prosecuted, even the most, of course, at the moment of sentencing. And there was never anybody I prosecuted who I didn't think was guilty and deserved it, but a sense of having some understanding also was often with me. But that was because I was in an environment that allowed it. And but I was in an office where people talked to each other about books.